So, David, let's talk about that a little bit. So, the first couple of questions here, we talked about transformational styles and talked about transformational leadership, a little bit about transactional leadership. And then you shared with our listeners some ideas around identity development and the role of identity in leadership. So, now just to slightly change the direction of the conversation here a little bit, I'd like to talk about applying research insights to strengthening or developing leadership. And I know in your article titled Predicting Leadership Competency Development and Promotion Among High Potential Executives, the Role of Leader Identity. But in that article, you discuss the importance of leader identity. Can you elaborate on the key findings of that particular paper? And I think you shared a little bit of that just throughout the conversation so far, but can you just hit on some of the highlights and key findings of that particular research paper?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are two core takeaways from that paper. The first was a focus on different competencies, and we mentioned and talked about briefly competency models and
Hmm.
organization and leadership competencies. But there's a implicit assumption that these competencies all develop in the same way at the same time, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. And that's where trajectory kinds of analyses and studies can help us understand what kinds of competencies develop more quickly, which ones less quickly, and what are the implications then for leadership development in organizations. And the second takeaway is this notion of identity among high potential leaders. A lot of the early research that I was involved with in terms of understanding leader identity was done with students. And the students obviously have a lot more variability in terms of how they think of themselves as a leader than you would think high potential, more senior executives do. So it was this notion is like, well, maybe people who are high potential executives or high potential leaders identity is already fixed. Their leader identity is already high, and trying to develop identity among that population doesn't make a lot of sense. Well, in our research, what we found was that, yeah, there was restriction of range in terms of leaders' identification or identity as their leaders, but we still found similar effects as we found with undergraduates, but not on every competency. So why is that the case? Well, that just raises more questions. And as a researcher, what we say when we do research, we don't necessarily find a solution. We find that we need more research.
Yeah.
So, so in this particular case, we found that identity among high potential executives in a high potential leader development program was associated with more accelerated development of certain competencies, but not all the competencies. And what we also found, taking identity out of the mix, is that competencies developed at different rates. Some of them develop more quickly across this 5-month program, as indicated by the slopes of those trajectories, and others developed less quickly. So
Mm.
it's this notion of if you're designing leadership development interventions, you need to think more carefully about what is it that you want to develop and what the appropriate timescale might be for that.
Interesting. And David, your trajectory research hasn't shown any correlation between leadership style and leadership development, has it?
By leadership style, you mean like transformational
Yeah.
leadership or
Yeah. Is there anything like that come out of any of your research? I don't
it's
think that's what you're saying, but I was just curious.
no, but I think what we're looking at really is, and it is related to style indirectly, but it's not necessarily related to style as promoted in something like transformational leadership or transactional
Yeah.
leadership. It's really about the competencies that a particular organization or particular context find to be most valuable for their leaders. And
Mhm.
so the paper that we were talking about was conducted in a high potential leader development program and a large conglomerate in Australia.
Mm.
So they had their own leadership competency model, which was a lot more extensive than the 8 competencies we studied in this particular research, which, as an aside, can be an issue in and of itself. There are too many
Yeah.
competencies in the model that people kind of get lost in the mix of
Yeah.
what it takes to be an effective leader. But it's really back to this notion of being localized. What does leadership mean? Well, it tends to be localized, situationalized in a particular organizational context. And that's usually codified in whatever leadership competency model they've developed.
So, David, how do the findings then suggest how organizations can better identify and develop high potential leaders for managing organizational change?
Well, I think this notion of identity is important as a foundational characteristic of someone who is open to development and change. In psychology, we talk about people who have a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset.
Mhm.
A growth mindset is one where people can invest in developing themselves. They believe that they can change over time. They feel that they can get better in whatever domain. We'll talk about the domain of leader. We'll focus on the domain of leadership. So a growth mindset is really this notion that I'm someone who can change, and I am an agent of my own change. Whereas others have more of a fixed mindset, which is, well, I've got these traits. And these traits were kind of what I was born with, and I can't really change them. So I either got it or I don't got it.
Yeah.
And I think the leaders who will be the more high potential leaders of the future are the ones with this growth mindset that they can continue to change and develop over time, regardless how far or how high they go in any given organizational context.
Yeah. I mean, so really the growth mindset goes back to what we talked about previously, where it's a deliberate one. That growth mindset is a deliberate one that values self-reflection and assessment, taking on challenges, feedback on how you are doing, mentorship, and just understanding and reading and doing that research and understanding kind of what's out there in terms of the different leadership styles and what leadership looks like and what leadership doesn't look like.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, it's this notion that leadership is something that can be developed.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, Jack, there are a lot of people out there and a lot of executives and even senior executives who don't believe that. They believe you either got it or you don't got it.
Yeah.
And their approach is let's identify those who got it. And they haven't done a very good job at that.
Yeah, exactly. It goes way beyond some charisma, right? Being a good leader goes way beyond charisma.
There you go. Well, it's back to this notion that people try to simplify things into,
Yeah.
one assessment or one particular construct, and that's the magic bullet around leadership. But leadership is a much more complex construct than that.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, David, thank you for your time. This has been a fun conversation, and there's so much to unpack, as you know, when you start talking about leadership and leadership development and its impact on positive organizational change. But I do want to just ask you a couple more questions regarding the other article that I mentioned in the intro. And that is one called I Am a Leader, Examining Leader Identity Development Over Time. And in that article, you explore how leader identity evolves. And we touched on that a little bit, but can you share with our listeners what are the main takeaways from that research, from that paper specifically?
This is trying. Yeah, thank you, Jack. This one is a lot more technical, and it's using something called latent change score analysis to try to understand cause and effect. What the skills that cause changes in identities, or is it the changes in identity that causes the changes in skills?
Yeah.
And it's trajectory analysis. And in this case, we were looking at students. In this case, these were master students who were involved in a professional education course around leadership development. And we measured their change, and this was all self rated data. But we measured their identity and measured their self perception on leadership skills related to consideration or how well that they built relationships with other people, and what would be more task related kinds of initiating structure, classic dimensions in the leadership field. And we measured these 7 times over the course of a 7-week leadership module. And what we found was that changes in skills tended to be associated with changes in identity, not the other way around.
Mhm.
So it's really trying to unpack the holy grail of science of any sort, which is cause and effect.
Mhm.
So which happens first, identity or skills when it comes to development? There's some data from this one sample to suggest that it's skills change and skills development that is driving identity development over time.
Got it. Yeah. And David, let me ask you, can't self perception responses be heavily self biased?
They can, but the bias tends to wash out over time if you're using longitudinal kinds of analyses.
Yeah.
You would think that a bias would be that everybody rated themselves as really great in terms of their skills, but that's not what we found. Right? We find that some people rate themselves higher, some people rate themselves lower. How accurate they are is another matter that can be debated.
Yeah.
But if it was just a universal bias, we would find no results
Yeah.
because
Right.
everybody would rate themselves high. And over time, we just have a flat trajectory.
Yeah.
But again, that's not what we found. We found that J function, again, where people initially were very challenged in this developmental intervention, and both identity and their self-rated skills went down, followed by an uptick and a positive and linear trajectory over time in the
Yeah.
later waves of measurement.
Yeah. Yep. Trajectory research, or as you'd mentioned, latent score or latent change score analysis. But what a very interesting paper. And I thought it was very, very cool. And in fact, for our listeners, for both of these articles that we've discussed in this conversation today, we'll be sure to include in our show notes. And I highly recommend that you take a look at this. This is pretty good stuff here. But David, based on that research article, what would you say are some of the practical steps or interventions that organizations can implement to help their leaders develop a stronger and more effective leader identity then, based on what you learned from this paper specifically?
Yeah, that's a good question that I don't have a ready answer for. But I think one of the things that organizations do oftentimes that suppresses people in terms of internalizing a leader identity is to say that, unless you have a formal leadership position, unless you've been anointed as a high potential leader, you shouldn't have a leader identity. But I think we need more people who've internalized a leader identity as a way of bringing about the kinds of changes that we need in organizations. It's not that everybody's a leader and nobody's a follower.
Yeah.
What we know is that we do both. Everyone does both. Some may lead more than follow, some follow more than lead, but it's a dynamic process, not a position. So that's not necessarily something that came from this particular study, because the goals of that study were really about trying to disentangle causal relationships over time between skills and identity. But I think in that intervention, there was the space that everybody was expected to think of themselves as a leader. From my experience in some organizations, that's not the case. There's an actual normative base that dissuades certain people from thinking of themselves as a leader. And I think that's a massive waste of potential that we can't afford to continue as we move into even more complex times.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So David, I think, what I've heard consistently throughout our conversation today is that leadership can be learned, right? It can even be taught. And as you said, you can have some conversations around that idea. But then it also requires the intentful mindset for self starters. You got to have this intent. You got to have this mindset, this deliberate idea that, yes, I want to develop, I want to be a good leader. And just to go back to these points that you mentioned previously, I would actually say, and tell me if you agree, that whether good leaders realize it or not, this probably is a common denominator for leaders, right? Even leaders that really may not think they're paying attention to what academia says about research in the area and how to improve and that sort of thing. But the idea of self reflection and assessment, maybe this isn't accurate, but I would guess that the idea of self reflection and assessment, taking on challenges, being willing to take on feedback on how you're doing, mentorship, and then really understanding what good leadership, what it looks like or doesn't look like, rather. Would you say overall that good leaders, if you were to take all the good leaders and somehow just try to distill that down into some common denominators, wouldn't a majority of them kind of check the boxes for those 5 points?
I would like to think so, but there's still a mindset among a lot of leaders that they need to go away from their work in order to develop.
Hmm.
Taking people away from their work in order to develop through some retreat, through some multi-day kinds of developmental interventions, some other kinds of skills building that takes place outside of the job. But we know that across a lot of domains, it takes many, many years, many, many hours of deliberate practice in order to develop anything. And the conventional wisdom was 10 years, 10,000 hours, but there's a lot of individual differences around that. But, this notion of becoming an expert in any discipline, whether it's chess, whether it's gaming, whether it's music, whether it's sport, it takes a lot of dedicated practice over a long period of time. And leaders who only look to develop in offsite kinds of interventions and workshops are never going to get that kind of practice time. They've got to use the most valuable resources, which is their time on the job and their attentional resources to understand the kinds of challenges that they are in the midst of and learn from them as they're happening.
Yeah, and I must say that I've known some pretty good leaders, and when you think back, some of them I would say out of those 4 or 5 items that I'd mentioned, they all like to take on a challenge. I would say for the most part, and I would say that's brute force experience when it comes to leadership, but maybe not so good on feedback on how they're doing, or maybe not so much in the self reflection department. And certainly a lot of them would have no idea the difference between, transformation and transactional, leadership theories and so forth, or what academia may have to say about leadership. Yeah, fascinating topic to be sure.
Well, I think it goes to the point. I think that anyone can become a better leader if they're willing to put in the time and the attention to, first understand where they're not leading as well as they could be.
Yeah.
And then how do you practice things that help enhance that development of those competencies over time? So, it's really this notion of ongoing assessment, challenge, and support that develops leaders on an ongoing, continuous, everyday kind of basis.